it's great to be here in Washington, D.C., where we are joined by Mick Mulvaney. You know him as a great friend to this show, but also he's a former chief of staff to Donald Trump, who had something of a mixed week with the midterm elections. Mick, thanks so much for joining us. Now, gotta ask you, a lot of people are saying that Donald Trump took a big hit this week because so many of his candidates failed to perform in the midterms. What does he need to do to get himself back in the kingmaker role that he so clearly cherishes for the Republicans?
That's a great question. He had some big losses on Tuesday night, as you know, James. He lost a bunch of Senate races with his surrogates. He lost a bunch of governor's races with his surrogates. But as we sit here and chat tonight, there's one Senate race that is still not going to be decided for several weeks. That's the Georgia race. And as we stand here tonight, it looks like control of the Senate will depend on the outcome of that race, just as it did 2 years ago in Georgia. Trump needs to get into that race heavy. Herschel Walker is one of his closest friends. They used to work together. Herschel played football for him when Donald Trump owned a football team. He needs Herschel Walker to win. He needs to help Herschel Walker to win. If he does, then Trump is back on the rise. If he loses, that adds even more to a really, really terrible week so far.
But that's a really high-risk proposition. I mean, if he goes down to Georgia and he spends the next several weeks campaigning for Walker, but then Walker doesn't get over the line, I mean, that's going to really damage the Trump brand. Does that mean that someone like a Ron DeSantis is now the presumed power center in the Republican Party, or are people getting too enthusiastic about that too quickly?
Yeah, no, Ron had a great night. Ron's a friend of mine, and you could not have a better night than he had, and he is a legitimate contender for the presidency, no question. But he is not the heir apparent. He is not displacing Trump yet. He had a really good week, and there's a lot of folks now pointing to him. He's getting a lot of attention. But to say that Donald Trump is over and Ron DeSantis is in is folks who don't understand it, not only American politics, but especially Donald Trump.
All right, so Mick, if Donald Trump is still in the game, Ron DeSantis is absolutely an up-and-comer, and as you say, he had a fantastic night in Florida. But who are some other names that people should be watching?
Yeah, there's a bunch of really good young Republicans. By the way, some good young Democrats. We can talk about that maybe in a second as well. But you've got Ron DeSantis, you've got Tim Scott from South Carolina, Nikki Haley from South Carolina. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, wants to run for president. Mike Pence is expected to run for president. You've got a governor just across the river here in Virginia named Glenn Youngkin, whose name keeps coming up as a potential challenger. There's some really good next generation leaders in the party.
Now, I think a lot of U.S. Report viewers are pretty familiar with Mike Pompeo. They know Mike Pence, who's pretty controversial with a lot of Trump supporters. Yeah. So, that might hurt him there. But tell us a bit more about Tim Scott and Glenn Youngkin, because I agree, these are two big names who in the next 10 years, 12 years, may be the ones who will be sitting at the top of that ticket. A little bit about each of them for our viewers.
Yeah, Glenn Youngkin, businessman, won in a really, really purple state. In fact, he won probably in a little bit of a blue state in Virginia. It's a huge win for the Republican Party. It was supposed to be the bellwether for what was supposed to be this red wave last night. Virginia often sort of indicates which way the country is going. So it's a huge win for Republicans, and he was a really, really good candidate. Tim Scott, a name you need to know, African-American Republican from South Carolina, one of the nicest men you are ever going to meet in your entire life. What I tell people is, if the country really is interested in coming back together and healing itself from whatever we've been through the last 20 years, Tim Scott is the kind of guy who could do that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Democrats, too. From where I sit, it looks like, in the old days of the Cold War, and you were looking at Lenin's tomb and all the old geriatric Soviets sitting up there in their wheelchairs. Now, there are younger people coming through, you're saying. Who are some people who we might not have heard of? Because I don't think the Democrat bench looks all that deep at the moment.
Yeah, the names you hear about, I don't think are the real contenders. You hear about Gavin Newsom and Pritzker in Illinois.
Yeah, they're not going anywhere.
The Democrat Party, the last time they nominated a true progressive, or at least who ran as a progressive, won as a progressive, and then campaigned for president as a progressive, was 1972 with George McGovern. They like to pick centrists, or at least people who can pretend to be centrist. That's not Newsom, it's not Pritzker. Jared Polis, governor of Colorado, is on the list. Cory Booker, who ran a miserable race in 2020. I understand he's retooling his national campaign. Things look good there. There's a couple of different names from around the country. Amy Klobuchar, a very moderate woman from Minnesota. They've got some decent names as well once they clear Biden out of the way.
Now, I want to ask about a trend thing, because I was going through and doing a deep dive in the numbers before and saying, well, where were the states that there were big flips? There were a lot of flips in New York State.
Yeah.
There were a few flips in California especially. But one of the things we've also seen is that the blue states are losing population while the red states are gaining population as people basically, turn into refugees from Democrat policies, and they wind up in places like Florida. What's that going to do then to the politics of America? Is it going to make it harder for anybody to come and be a united candidate for the entire country?
No, I think it changes the balance of power. It doesn't make it any more difficult to sort of unite the country. Florida is growing. That's a red state. We talked about that. Texas is growing. That's a red state. For the first time in the history of this nation, California lost a congressional seat in the last redistricting. So that's getting smaller. New York is getting smaller. And folks are moving to the southern states. The question is, will they bring their politics with them? You see a lot of people leaving California because it's too liberal, and then they move to Austin, Texas, and they vote liberal. So that will be interesting to see that demographic shift over the course of the next 10 years.
And very finally, Mick, so many people who do remain in those states like New York, California, where things are really tough with crime and illegal immigration, all the other problems we hear about. Why did so many of them still vote for more of the same?
Some of them did and some of them didn't. I think in some cases, every race is different. It just is. There was sort of hints of the red wave, or was supposed to be the red wave in New York. The campaign director for the Democrats in Congress, Sean Patrick Maloney, lost his race.
Yep.
That hasn't happened in 40 years to lose somebody of that position. So crime did play a role in some of these states. Inflation did, but every race is local, and it's sort of hard to paint with a broad brush. The one national sort of movement was Donald Trump. And I think a lot of folks were able to paint Republicans with the Donald Trump brush, and that did not sell to independent voters.
Mick Mulvaney, always a pleasure, and even more of a pleasure to be able to do it here in person in Washington. Thanks so much.
It's great to be here.